Okay, thank you very much for coming out tonight to the start of our Impossible Ideas series, which is one of many different programs that we'll be hosting here at the Academy of the Impossible. The Impossible Ideas will run on alternating Thursdays and Sunday mornings in both a brunch format and an evening discussion. Rick Salutin has been very kind and generous to be our first guinea pig, partly because every year I come in and speak to Rick's class at U of T, and this year when he asked, I was smart enough to hit up for a quid pro quo of getting him in, and I felt that we
cheap at that price.
It's mutual, certainly, as the deal works. Yeah, exactly. And we felt for tonight's subject we'd want to look at Revolt 2012. I've spent a bit of time looking at popular uprisings over the last few decades, over the last 12 months, and try to speculate on what we expect to happen in the next 12 months, both here in Toronto and around the world. Mark Weisblot, who is the editorial director of MetaViews, is here to play the role of web jockey. So he has the rather difficult task of trying to surf while we talk and try to bring up imagery that reflects whatever it is that we're talking about, both to satisfy those of us with ADD who need some kind of screen providing visual entertainment, but also to try to bring at least some context, both to the historical side as well as the last 12 months and some of the stuff moving forward. My name's Jesse Hirsch. I'm both the president of MetaViews and a faculty here at the Academy of the Impossible. There are other people here from the Academy of the Impossible who are available to talk to. Certainly Mark will be using Twitter as a way for all of you to participate before we do open it up for questions. Luke, who happens to be the person who tweeted about Rick's socks, does have another microphone, so when we do open it up, flag him down to be able to participate on the record. We are recording this for posterity, for uploading on YouTube, and just for kicks. This is our first event in this configuration in the space, so we do expect bugs. We've yet to procure a screen for the center projector, so expect a little bit of glitches. Hello, Mr. Quarterly. Glad you could make it. Not a problem. You're right on time. So with that said, Rick Salutin, as I mentioned, as a columnist currently with the Toronto Star, previously with the Globe and Mail, and perhaps many other publications over the years. Writer, playwright, critic, intellectual, all-around smart guy. And as I mentioned, teaches a fascinating course at University College at University of Toronto, which I took 15 years ago, maybe?
You're the only person who ever took it twice.
Yes! Took it 1 year, dropped because it didn't fit with my schedule, but took it again because the subject matter of Chomsky, Innes, McLuhan, and all the rest was really quite fascinating. So for those of you like me who like to squat and hack into educational institutions, auditing his course from the back, in theory with his approval, but even with not, is something I highly encourage as thoroughly entertaining and evolving. So I wanted to start tonight's discussion really by starting in the past. I found in 2011 a lot of comparisons were being made with 1968, both because of the I think, level of uprising in terms of internationally, of it happening around the world, the youth component, the student component, and the media dynamic. And I don't mean that in terms of the mainstream sense, but in the sense of alternative and counter media playing a clear role, I think, in mobilizing and promoting some of the revolts and some of the uprisings that were occurring. So I'm curious if we wouldn't start, given that I'm obviously too young to have been alive in that era, and you were, whether you, as well as my two fathers and mother sitting in the front row here. I'm curious whether it's with regard to Rochdale or with regard to, say, what was happening in Mexico City, in Paris, in the United States in terms of the Vietnam War, the civil rights, whether you think that parallel is appropriate, whether there's a justification for a parallel, or whether the late 60s were completely different and not appropriate to compare to our current uprisings.
I see you've actually got up the column that I wrote. I finished a few hours ago, and it actually does talk about, I encountered Tantan on on the streets of Paris in the early 70s, because I ran into a lot of those soixante outards, those people who'd been active in Paris in May of '68, and they were still sort of shell-shocked at that point. They'd gone so high, they felt they were going to overthrow de Gaulle and establish a new world, and then it had failed. And they were still drifting around Paris trying to figure out what to do next. And they loved Tintin. And I think the reason was, thinking about it, was they liked the playfulness. They were trying to distinguish themselves from the revolutionaries of the '30s, who they thought were too sober, like the Communist Party and Sartre, and the resistance. And they were playful in the same sense that the yippies in the US in those years said they were Marxists, but they meant Groucho, not Karl, you know. And I was, in '68 itself, I was at Columbia University in New York, which was one of the locales for the student uprising in the US. But one of the slogans, I mean, I thought about this place as well when I was writing about it, because one of the impossibilism, I think, came out of that. Is that what you had in mind when you did this? Yeah. Yeah, and there was a lot of talk about that. It was romantic, actually. It was very romantic. It was a thought, you know, dream the impossible, it'll become real, that kind of thing. Now, that's a neat idea as motivation in poetry. But it did flounder on what do you, the tricky question became, what do you do next? And when the other side reacts, what do you do? Or in a sense, if they don't react. I mean, I can remember in those years I was in New York through till basically till the point at which Trudeau declared martial law in Canada in October 1970. I've been in the States. But I remember during one of those severe uprisings of those years when we thought we had the whole U.S. on the run, all the universities were occupied, actually. That was the same term that was used. I remember I had to go uptown. I was at a place at that point in the village called, well, the New School. And I'd been sleeping there, and we'd been active, and people from the ad agencies have been coming after work and saying, what can we do to stop this damn war? You felt like you were on the verge of something. Then I had to go uptown for some reason to the 40s or 50s. And I got out of the subway and looked around, and I couldn't believe it. Life was going on as normal, you know. None of those people on Fifth Avenue or on Broadway seemed to have had their normal activity interrupted at all. So that became, in a sense, you know, when you petered out, there wasn't a next step. The other way it was different, I think, is the absolutism. But that was part of the same thing, you know, you just had your vision, you wanted to revolutionize the world. It was pretty doctrinaire. It was socialism or communism or Maoism. We were Maoists in particular. But it was, there was an absolute rupture that you saw between what was going on now and what you wanted to establish. I don't think you get that sense now. I've traveled a bit in the last few months. I was in Tunis and in Madrid and at the Occupy movement at St. Paul's in London. And there isn't that same sort of absolutism. So it makes it more possible to make some sort of a transition and maintain some continuity. When they lost in '68 in France, there was just nowhere to go because you had this absolute vision of an absolute rupture. And then when it didn't happen, first of all, you were shocked because you believed in it. And then, you know, then you just didn't know what to do.
Well, and what's interesting too, I think, in the contrast between now and then is the period in between, in which certainly in my lifetime there was a steady erosion of the notion of protest, of the notion of being in the streets. And then as the internet rose out, it almost for a while became an obsolete idea, that it was just dead meat in the streets, and that the future was hacktivism. And then we almost like we've come full circle in a very short period of time, where all of a sudden there's a lot of power in the streets, whether that's demonstrated in terms of the Middle East or in terms of the occupations, that in and of itself has allowed those discussions, those politics to come back. Was there a sense that you saw where that really started to fade? And what's interesting is you described this sort of rupture, this gap, as a real embedded fail.
Like falling. It was just like stepping off a cliff. But I don't think it's a full circle. Actually, it's a spiral, because it's moved on from where it was, because. I think what seems to have happened is that the hacktivism has become a component in the activism. Well, that's good. You know, it's kind of nice to see something concrete and positive happen like that. None of the stuff that happened in Tunis or in Madrid could have happened as it did without the interaction on the internet. And it may have helped actually make it more real. Because, you know, this is another thing about, you know, if you want to distinguish, I don't know if it's interesting even to go over this stuff, but that stuff in the 60s and 70s was pretty authoritarian in its way. It always involved absolute visions of what was right and what was wrong, and strong leaders who articulated it at every level, so that every movement had its damn leader. It was really kind of disgusting, actually. And they were egomaniacs. They had all the signs of egomania when they spoke. They spoke in you know, authoritarian terms, and they expected everybody to agree with them. There's no sign of that now. I don't see any of it. It's partly because the doctrine is gone, and it's partly because maybe it's because if you don't have doctrine, you can't have, you know, doctrinists who impose the doctrine. So I think in that way, and some of that may have come from the. I mean, in those days, you know, your texts were sacred texts. It was Mao's Red Book, or the Communist Manifesto, or I don't know, Trotsky something, or you know, whatever it was. But it was a set text. Nobody could question it. You just had to choose a text and adhere to it. The texts now are just constantly shifting and distracting. You can't even keep your you know, you can't even keep your train of thought in a way, and that's probably a positive thing as far as not getting stuck in some sort of dogma.
Well, and it ties quite nicely into media theory, that with text you have a leader, you have a figurehead.
I think so, yeah.
With no text, no figurehead, no leader, no doctrine, which also dovetails nicely into the media coverage, which, you know, granted there was, 3 networks back then, if that at all, so the media coverage wasn't as much of an issue. Versus now, it's almost as if the moment Occupy, for example, occurred, there was a huge amount, once it tipped over from Wall Street into other communities, there was a huge amount of media coverage that then went hostile because there wasn't a leader, because there wasn't a message, because there wasn't an easy way to fit it into that framework.
I think it went hostile, but it also went kind of smug and complacent because they didn't know what to do. So therefore, there had to be something wrong with this, because am I reverb or something? I think that's right.
Now, I kind of want to skip over the period between the late 60s and the present, but I would for a moment want to talk about globalization, because you know the globalization movements were an interesting sort of segue, in that they involved a lot of mobilization, whether Seattle or Quebec City or some of the stuff that happened in DC and Torino around the world. But they almost seem more like 68 in that they were demanding this huge kind of change that was never going to happen, compared to what we're seeing now, which seems really quite realistic and pragmatic, in that in many cases, granted, you know, there isn't a single issue, but Occupy creating that counter space, that counter power in different municipalities was its own type of tangible progress, in contrast to the spectacles around globalization that sort of came, protested.
I think that's right.
But like the 60s, it wasn't clear what it was that they were looking to achieve.
Well, I think what they were looking to achieve was clear, but what they were going to do when it didn't just I don't know, you know, fall in like a coin going into a slot or something. What they would do when that didn't happen wasn't. So I think, I think we had an interesting moment in globalization in 1989 when there was a federal election over free trade in Canada. And there was actually a popular movement, a resistance movement here that was pretty impressive, I think. It was, what was great about it was, as soon as the Mulroney, like it was in the name, under the name of free trade, not globalization, although the term globalization was around. We made a mistake, I think, in choosing to fight it as anti-free trade. We basically, you know, chose to try and refight the War of 1812 and stir up nationalism. And it was the resistance to the U.S., whereas it probably should have been, you know, if we'd been more farsighted, it would have been globalization. But the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, I think, was the first real step in the globalization, in the economic globalization of the world. And we had a really serious movement that was national and that was a coalition that brought together numerous different social groups, unions, farmers, artists. It was just that there had never been anything like it. And it worked rather well. But it was still, it didn't have the interactivity, of course, because the capacity for that wasn't there. But what was good about it was you had a focus. And the focus was defeat the Mulroney Tories, and if you do, you defeat free trade. Now, it got fucked up because of the stupid electoral system we had. We did get a large majority of votes against Mulroney, but they were split between the Liberals and the NDP, as has happened ever since, or at least a lot of the time ever since. So free trade went through with 43% of the votes because of the kind of system, and Mulroney got a majority. But it was great as far as finding, I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense, this thing about finding this link, but it seems to me that the challenge for, let's say, anarchists, for example, which is, you know, a totally appealing approach to political reality, I think. But the challenge is, at what point how do you link to the mechanisms of power so you aren't just constantly spinning your wheels in a fascinating romantic way? And in that case, we had it because you could focus on this election and try and defeat the Mulroney government. We didn't, but it was a concrete way to go.
Well, and I think historically it's worth noting the moments when progressive forces, for lack of a better phrase, in Canada are able to come together around that common cause. And you're right that the 88 and the 92 elections in terms of the free trade debates were really important. And I think what's frustrated us in the last couple of elections is how Harper is really just focusing on such a narrow slice of the Canadian population. And yet the people most upset at that seem incapable of coming together until Occupy came about. That certainly Occupy was the first time that I saw progressives and radicals and even kind of left-leaning liberals starting to feel that there was something that gave them a sense of hope, that gave them a sense that it wasn't just about, you know, globalization or the Harper agenda, that there was a way to really stand up to that, you know, as electoral reform, as Mez would often say, the focus that we should be having, because electorally there's just no way that rural Canada is going to support a lot of the issues that those of us in major urban centers
I'm not sure. I don't think we agree on that. I think that, the Occupy, in some ways, you know, the Occupy movement was similar to some of the stuff in the 60s. It was kind of a high. You know, it was a great trip. And you felt good about it, but you know, I think these things, these movements, protest movements are always there, and you can almost always find something to give you hope. The real problem, that I'm trying, you know, I think I'm going to sound repetitive, because you end up just sort of concentrating on whatever is in your head at the moment. It's hard to get away from it. And it has to do with that link between, the energy and the opposition that's out there very often. You know, we live in a time, I don't even think it's unusual, but we certainly live in a time where there is, I think, actually massive consensus on radical transformation. I think that's why the Occupy movement, it wasn't that they didn't have a specific message, it was that the specific message was general. It was change the agenda. This agenda has to change. And it's fairly clear what some of the components of it are. You know, it's something like nationalize the banks, regulate finance. It's basically kind of a serious social democratic program. Have more equitable taxation so you can redistribute. It's changing the agenda, and it's basically toward a social democratic program that the NDP, for instance, has almost nothing to do with at this point. But the problem is still that when people get to vote, they don't have a chance to vote for that. So, for example, I was in Spain in November, just before the election. So I was, you know, I talked to a lot of people who were in the the May 15 movement, the Indignados. They're great. They were by far the most sophisticated people I've talked to anywhere about this stuff. And public opinion polling has the whole country on their side, or a large majority. There's still that sort of Francoist constituency in Spain. So it's not but it's like 60%, 50, probably 60% behind them and sympathize with them. That poll takes place. Then a week after I was there, they have the election and they vote in this right-wing government, this, you know, very strongly neoconservative government. I don't think it's actually inconsistent. It's just that people have no way to express their feelings. I think the same thing is true here. I think probably most people agree with that broad view that was expressed in the Occupy movement about changing the agenda. And polling, I think, shows that for the most part. People are always way ahead. But how are you going to vote to do that?
Well, and if not voting, what's the vehicle? I mean,
exactly.
Is it popular movements as a counterpower?
Yeah, but okay, but my question then is, what would that mean? How would a popular movement that didn't engage in the electoral process implement its agenda? Or how would you do that?
Well, and I think the Council of Canadians were one example in the globalization era that tried to do that in a nonpartisan way, mobilize Canadians, try to get them to the ballot box where
To
possible.
do what?
But that's just it. I mean, I'm setting it up as a critique that they were really not effective at all. And while certainly when it came to free trade, were a major player in the debate, they no longer are, in spite of the fact that they probably still have a fairly sizable membership and database.
Sizable and age.
So, I mean, let's bring this back to media. I mean, to what extent, I mean, I think we, to some extent, recognize amongst young people the way that the internet gives them a channel, a voice, a way to either express dissent, to have a different discourse, and in their own world, whether it's around issues of copyright, whether it's around issues of freedom of expression, or even sexuality with the sort of the gay-straight alliance issues in terms of Catholic schools. But all of that is non-electoral. All of that still allows power, as it were,
well,
to
it's
keep
expression,
doing what it's
isn't
doing.
it? It's mostly sort of expressing yourself, which has a power of its own, but it doesn't transform the economy,
Well,
and it doesn't get you a job,
and it was
doesn't
also
get you health care.
Perhaps one of the failings of the situation is that to many extent that era was about, you know, change your mind and your ass will follow. Except that wasn't necessarily enough. That you
Or
need
raise
more.
consciousness and the world will transform. Well, it probably could, but it still requires some sort of conveyor mechanism where you get the consciousness transforms into policies or into housing or whatever it is people really need.
So is it a chicken and egg scenario of electoral reform versus different means of having the conversation around politics?
I think like a lot of things, there's no actual answer. There's probably a lot of things that would work. You just have to figure out something and go after it. I spent a long time on looking for journalism. It was a long time. It was like 3 or 4 months last year, looking at public education. And I came to this sort of staggering realization that there is no one particular right way to do public education or teaching. that almost anything will work if you're serious about it and really commit yourself and have figured out what you're doing. And I think that that may be the case. As I say, the people in Spain that, you know, that I met had the clearest idea about this. I think one of the reasons they were good in Spain was because they were young people I talked to mostly, and unemployed, people with a good, you know, with a few degrees often. They're all over the internet. But Spain in particular has the anarchist tradition. So when I went there, actually, I expected to find a kind of, that this would be the culmination of the anarchist tradition. And actually it was a lot more like the NDP, not the NDP, like social democracy, like the NDP should be. And it was partly because I think they'd been through, they knew the anarchist experience. They weren't seduced and mesmerized by it because it is so fascinating, it is so attractive. But they also had seen enough of it to say, okay, where does it actually get us? And so they didn't have to, I don't want to say wallow, but, you know, just kind of mess around in it for the fun of it. And they moved on to some quite practical strategies about how to take what they wanted and somehow see if they could integrate it into the society they were in. So for instance, in Spain, the Occupy movement deoccupied themselves. They didn't wait to be moved out by the cops. After about a month in Madrid and elsewhere, they said, let's get the hell out of here. We're not doing that much. And they moved out into the neighborhoods and are still working there.
Almost as if they've understood the importance of that anti-authoritarian critique from anarchism and have integrated that back into a much broader social democracy that they feel can build the types of bridges within political society.
But not from, but what the way you put it implies that it's a sort of a deductive process. And it wasn't actually. It was from the meetings that they had and the discussions that they had emerged this notion that they could just see we don't want to just be talking to ourselves. And so they spread it out into the community. Who knows, you know, what will come of it? But it's a much more hopeful and concrete approach than anything I've seen elsewhere. And I don't think in North America I've seen that. Somehow there's this rhetorical style around protest movements that seems to say if you've got your emotions and your values right, the result has to tumble out. And I think it's partly a fear that you don't have the answer, so you just have to pretend it'll happen automatically. But probably you do have to work out an actual strategy.
Now, with the usual disclaimers around predicting the future being entirely inaccurate and so on and so forth, let us take a few moments to try to speculate on what we think the next 12 months will bring. Both locally with what looks like a city work stoppage, so maybe a couple of months in which the city is involved in a very public and protracted labor dispute, which certainly adds grist to any type of oppositional or counterpower. But around the world, like, will there be a second wave to the Arab Spring? Will the United States, you know, literally wake from its slumber of complacency to have a third movement that is not Republican or Democrat that can try to hold power accountable? Do you have any sense of?
Not a clue. Not a clue. I mean, nobody predicted this stuff. I mean, I just going to cop out on this. I mean, I gave up on even thinking about predictions when the Soviet Union imploded after nobody even had a hint about it. And then Nelson Mandela not only got out of prison for being a terrorist, but became president of South Africa and then retired. It's just, you know, none of the big things seem to happen. And this movement of the last year, there was just no indication. And the Arab Spring was totally unpredicted, I think. I mean, when it happened, people weren't surprised. And Tunis was the purest case and still is. But they weren't surprised, but they sure weren't expecting it.
Now, I partly threw in that last question as an open question to the crowd, too, that I would, as we start to open it up, both invite questions for our very gracious guest, but also offer your own predictions, your own thoughts on what you think will happen in the next 12 months. Luke Simcoe, who's just standing up there and standing in the back, has a microphone, so at any point starting from now, feel free to catch his attention, put up your hand so that he can see your hand and not necessarily so that we can see your hand. So that means, John, to put up your hand so he can see it, not so that we can see it. And by all means, participate in the discussion and general conversation. We've certainly done more of, I think, a political weave through this narrative. And I am also interested in the media theory, because it is something you and I both enjoy talking about.
Well, you should talk more about that. I'll say what I think.
Well, and before I throw to you, John, who has spent actually quite a bit of time in Occupy Toronto, so it makes sense that he's first and eager to get in line. To what extent do you feel because obviously the difference between now and 68 is the internet and the fact that, this is a de facto TV channel, that we can record this and put this up for whoever to see.
It's huge, yeah.
To what extent, and I kind of want you to argue both sides very briefly, to what extent do you think that helps protest movements, helps counterpowers express themselves? But at the same time, to what extent do you think it hurts because they're just one voice amongst millions? That it is such a segmented, fragmented universe.
But a consensus does emerge, doesn't it? So that's what. So it's not one voice. It's many voices speaking as one that tend to emerge, and that's a completely kind of democratic and hopeful phenomenon. I think the absence of leadership is great. Both on the left. I mean, the other thing I thought, I wrote about this, but I thought that the Time magazine person of the year, it used to be the man of the year, and then became the person of the year, is the protester. And the piece they wrote was just pathetic. They just are nowhere near getting it. They took that authoritative Newsweek Time tone that they used to get away with. And partly because people were so isolated. So everybody read that Time. It was partly the phenomenon that Chomsky came along and did a lot to undermine. That you hear this hollow, pompous, authoritative, stupid voice making these pronouncements, but you're alone. So you think, oh, it must be something wrong with me. And then you first had Chomsky, and then I think Jon Stewart has played such a role in undermining this stuff, because he just plays it back and makes faces. And then there's that huge audience looking, saying, oh yeah, that's my reaction too, so I'm not wrong, this is idiotic. And the only people who don't get how idiotic it are the people at Time. So that's, I think, tremendous. And I think the more, and it's all about interaction, it's all about getting a chance to question, hearing voices. All you have to do is question that crap, and it just dissolves in your face. But in the age of one-way mass media, it didn't happen, or it happened very rarely. I think that's why Chomsky became such an incredible phenomenon, this international hero. He's like Robin Hood or something, for the late 20th century. And it was because he was giving voice to this stuff.
So, John, before you say what you'd like to say, I'd like to first allow you to get me a level on that mic, because we haven't tested. So you want to just talk in that mic so I get the level?
1 2 1 2.
Okay,
test,
good.
Test.
Yes.
I don't probably need a voice right mic, but somebody else.
And the
might.
second thing I would add is, John, you were the person to suggest time limits.
Exactly,
on
my
people
friend.
Participating. So, do you think you could regulate yourself with
Yes,
90
certainly.
seconds? Is that enough
I
time?
like that. Great. I'm glad you listened to me.
And David is volunteer timekeeper. So
We got some feedback here, by the
two
way.
British gentlemen. It's because you're in front of the speaker.
Why don't you angle the speaker, twist it on the thing so it points across that way.
It's your limit. Go ahead. You talk. I'll work your limit.
All right, okay. Yeah, oh, shoot, 90 seconds, about 5 subjects. One of the problems
Hold the
is...
mic to your mouth. That helps.
Oh, sorry. One of the problems I see is that we have to remove the problem of the economy. The economy really doesn't matter without democracy. So we have to start plugging democracy in a totally different way so that we remove the unfettered control of capitalism and the economy, which is, it doesn't work, it's not working, and that's why we've got all the problems. With regards to Occupy, there was great consensus there. It was difficult. people didn't understand the process. My analogy was it was like an engine that had 100 pistons going up and down, and they all went up and down different times, and it produced movement forward. It's still going on. The press are downplaying it, which is really annoying, which brings me to another point. Occupying the press are controlled by Big Blue. You have really great reporters who are then censored by their editors, who are controlled by the guys at the top. And unless we start removing that and go to other places like Judah Rebick's, Rabble, thank you, and from free media, so we don't get this Big Blue mentality, then I don't see how the hell we're going to actually get anywhere. With reference to next year with city politics, we have a dictator both in Parliament, in Ottawa, and in Toronto. And because he has public meetings, Mr. Ford thinks that's democracy. And having been to 2 of the big meetings there, he listens to the stuff and then he has proposals done or just negates anything that 120 or 350 people have spent all day waiting to speak. And that isn't democracy. It's a real farce, absolute farce. And we have to start attacking that and bring that down. And I don't know how we do it, except just mobilize and get together. And one thing I have learned through doing my engineering, all the answers are here. There's so much here with people like you, Rick, and all the people. We've got the ideas. We just need to put it together. But the final point is, the people who believe in real democracy, have to say, you will lead this piston or this piston because that's your expertise. 5 seconds. Thank you. All this is my expertise, so we have leaders that change as opposed to one big leader that can screw us royally.
And I think...
Did I do well?
You did great, John. That was perfect. And I think further that there's one thing we didn't touch upon that I think following John's comments is perhaps worth coming back to, and that's the connection between local and global. That what was interesting in the last 12 months, that there was a real sense of global solidarity, that people really did feel in Fredericton, at the Occupy Fredericton, that they were connected to the other occupies around the world. And I think certainly regionally in the Arab Spring, there was a sort of pan-Arab nationalism that was fueling a lot of that drive. So 2 questions. Did that exist in the late 60s, that sense of international connection? And to what extent do you think in the current context that can be continued, given the kind of, inherent navel-gazing that most people tend to
Well, I think it existed theoretically, for sure, in the 60s. It existed theoretically in the 1930s. But there's a real difference between the concreteness of it, actually knowing the people. Like my kid, for instance, I got a 13-year-old who's sitting at home right now. And when I was his age, I went to the Holy Blossom Temple and we sang brotherhood songs about, black hands, white hands, yellow hands, brown, all together they built this town. So we had this really good kind of international, interracial solidarity sense, except in Foresthill we didn't know anybody except other Jewish kids. And you never saw anybody in Toronto who wasn't white. So you could have the principle, but it was abstract. Gideon, where he goes to school at Batherston College, it's just they don't see colors. So I think what the internet does is also is make those things concrete. I remember when we fought the free trade fight, it was exhausting, it was exhilarating, we lost, but we felt we'd actually raised our voices and given a real scare to these people with power. But I remember when it was over, a friend of mine, Laurel Ritchie, was in the union movement and said, what she really wants to see happen next is to say to these guys, okay, you want globalization, we'll give you globalization. And in some senses, I think that's what has come about. I'm not sure what was the other part? It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
David's got a question. I guess, Luke, you got a question in the back, so come on to David after Kev.
I was just wondering, so we're touching briefly on how the internet kind of helped to facilitate communications, but do you feel it's made protests stronger, or has, say, protests in the past had a different means of coming together and organizing?
Yeah, people always find a way to get together. But it's just, again, I don't know if you would have predicted this, that that the internet would turn out to have facilitated live face-to-face activity and become, a sort of a servant to that rather than an alternative to it. Is that what you expected to happen?
It certainly matches with the sociological research that everyone ignored that said it is about using the technology for people to connect in the real world. And what happened was the Nicholas Negropontes and the Derek DeKirchhoffs all said, no, the streets...
This is all going to be virtual.
Yeah. And to some extent, there's a seduction to that I think we're all kind of glad is being debunked, as certainly mobile devices are used around social media to connect in the real world and get people together in the real world.
No, that's delightful. That's really delightful. When I was in Spain, for instance, I met with a lot of these young people, mostly guys. No, not entirely, but it was probably the majority. But a lot of them, we had these great conversations in cafes or while we were marching or something. And then they would tell me afterwards that they had never actually met before, but they knew each other really well. And they had close personal relationships. They'd say, when I talked to them one-on-one, they'd say, well, I don't know, they said, of course, live in person is different from virtual. And then they'd say and they'd say, for instance, Jose, I really know him very well. I know what his problems are. So there is some sort of melding of that stuff that takes place. And then they're really delighted to see each other. I mean, the question I often had in mind in those 60s demonstrations was, when the cops charge, as they often did, who can you count on to stick there with you and not bolt? And it was very rarely the people with the rhetoric. It was almost always people you'd never expected to, which is what you find in the labor movement. If you've been on a picket line or in a strike, the ones who shoot their mouths off in the union meeting and at the strike vote beforehand are rarely the ones who are out there on the line 3 months later. But I think you can probably get a better sense because you're not giving speeches on the internet. You're actually engaging. The other thing I thought was, for me, as a real kind of, quite a Neanderthal in this stuff, is my sense of the internet, especially in the early years, which carried over for me, was that it was largely for exercises in egomania and flame, that goes back to the flame wars, but it's also what I get at the Globe and Mail or at the Star. Less at the Star, thankfully, but no. But at the Globe, you just get, or you go on. I go on Bill O'Reilly's show occasionally, and so people can find me at whatever paper I am, and this hate gets spewed, and mostly it's along the line. It's not like your socks are goofy. It's like you are so ugly, and you get the impression, but so you miss the point that this is a misuse. And it's actually, it's obsolete versus this actual kind of quiet interaction, which the fruit of which was the Occupy movements, I think.
Well, and it's also, I think, why social media and the prefix social has been so important, because it speaks to the social drive and the social nature that people want. Now,
that's a great point.
David, you're up on the mic. John, do you want to count 90 seconds for David while he has his opportunity so that we've got fair...
Mike, the time you can have. What I was going to say was...
Use the mic, David, so we have
Actually,
it on
before
record.
David goes, I just wanted to put myself on the speaker's list.
Okay,
after him.
you're after
So
David?
it's
Okay.
Sort of the tyranny of the mic is that you're always running around. And anyway.
Okay, David, then Luke.
I was just thinking about all the things that you were talking about and had lots of things to say, but the thing that I have now is...
Speaking of the mic.
Is the effect... I'm surprised at how, this particular, the Occupy movement really proliferated quickly, and it ended quickly.
Still going.
Yeah, I think it's current tense, still active.
In contrast to like the anti-war movement that I was part of, and other things that other people have been part of that seem to prolong. So the question was, does the media? Here's the question: do our new media have an effect on the speed and of a growth and decline of these voices.
And emphasized by the fact that David felt via the media that Occupy had ended, when in fact it still continues. So I think there's two sides to that. The acceleration of the cycle, of the rise, the peak, and the decline of these types of movements, that do the media artificially speed that up, and further, do they artificially end these things when in fact they continue otherwise?
That's what I wanted to say.
Did you want to address that?
Well, let's say what's your thought on that? Because I'm still trying to formulate.
I agree. Yes, I mean I think all media, new media and traditional media, have a desire to accelerate, have a desire to push things prematurely a little forward, have a desire to find that peak, and you see this with the NDP leadership race, that it hasn't really started, and they're talking about front runner, and they're talking about, underdog, and it speaks to a way through the horse race culture, that competitive culture, that yes, it does accelerate. And Research in Motion, I think, is feeling this right now in the pressures that they're feeling to accelerate their recovery, to accelerate their new products, and further that things die, right? The idea that Occupy is dead when it's not. The idea that certain products die when they're not, that companies die. Speak into the mic.
What's not dead about Occupy is the focus of it. And the focus of it is financial reform. Just like the focus of the 60s was a war that wasn't. So the focus, but the focus seems to have, is still there.
But there's
that
still
action.
There's a meeting going on right now, actually.
Did you?
Going on with Occupy every day.
Did you want to respond to that, Rick?
Well,
at all?
yeah, I'm not so plugged into the Toronto Occupy situation. I went down there while it was on, but it doesn't seem to me that it was an end in itself. It's a moment in a social process. It doesn't have to be represented by a physical occupation. It doesn't have to be called Occupy. But I don't think it's good enough to kind of apotheosize it as some sort of spirit that hovers over reality and that gives us hope. I think it's a matter of, that's why I said, are there concrete forms that this can evolve into? And that's why I just said quickly, these Madrid people were so fascinating because they said, okay, we're going to disband our own movement. It's not about us. It's not about our occupation. It's about maintaining developing the issues that we have made our points on, and going out into our neighborhoods, which they've done. But the most interesting, and they have weekly assemblies, and according to them, I didn't get to go any, but they said it's not just the usual suspects. But the most interesting theoretical part of it, I thought, was they weren't trying to, they thought they could work through given the existing electoral system. But what was required was an intermediate layer that doesn't now exist of public input, collective input into the political process, so that you hold these weekly meetings, they forward proposals that have to be, they would favor changing the system so that the elected bodies have to simply receive and pay attention to these proposals. And what it does is it would transform the electoral process. Because by the time you got to one of these isolated once every 4-year elections, I'm still okay, right?
That's fine. It's just the wind suck.
Then people would be much more informed of what's going on. They wouldn't tune in and tune out every 4 years, which is what all the parties, including the NDP, depend on. And if you're only involved in politics once every 4 years, you're not going to be able to deal with specific issues. You have to focus on something like this party is good and those are bad, or this is a strong leader and that one isn't. And they thought they could transform it by not trying to develop a totally alternate political system, but by somehow structuring this layer, which seemed practical to do if it's hard work to keep doing it. So that's, at any rate, that was by far the most interesting development. And they stay in touch. In a way, one of the functions of the internet is they keep in touch. One of the other things is when an individual community, a neighborhood actually, discusses an issue and formulates its proposal. It then goes online along with the proposals from all across the country. And those are forwarded to a national assembly so people can see the connectedness. So I think there's, but you need the local live stuff, and then you need the sense that you're not isolated. And it was quite hopeful, I think. Actually.
Well, and that actually, before I throw to Luke and Romeo and a couple of hands in the back, or Luke for once after you do take your spot, I throw another question to the crowd, both in terms of asking for your own speculation on 2012, but also I think what Rick's been getting at with the Spanish example are movements that rise in the wake of Occupy, who see the opportunity created by Occupy. And so I'm curious if anyone wants to speculate on whether that will happen in Toronto, in North America, around the world. Luke.
Okay, well, I guess I want to ask what I hope is a fairly provocative question, principally inspired by the fact that I was just at Doc Soup last night and watched a really good documentary about the recent Ghanaian election in Ghana, and watching these sort of fledgling democratic countries renegotiate what democracy is for them and how it doesn't necessarily have to look like what it does for us. And I'm just kind of curious, like there's been all this talk of Occupy and, and things that are happening in Spain or America or Toronto and this kind of stuff. And, is it possible that we've sort of lost our opportunity to be the revolutionary vanguard, right? And should we now be focusing less on us and more on what's going on elsewhere, where democracy is still contingent, right? It's not so, to paraphrase Foucault, it's not so baked in the oven of history that we can't change these things anymore. And as sort of our economic power declines in the West, right, and the rise of the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, I'm just kind of curious what Rick thinks about how much we should be maybe turning our eye towards there. And I understand that the local matters. We have to be, kicking Rob Ford in the pants and doing all that kind of stuff. But, should we maybe kind of check ourselves a bit and kind of try to break out of this problem that since the 60s, the revolutionary vanguard, or whatever you want to call it, has always looked a lot like us, right? It's always looked like a bunch of sort of white Western people, and we're supposed to be the ones who affect all the reforms that make the world a better place. And I don't know, maybe it's time to drop that and look elsewhere.
That actually sounds kind of familiar to me. In the 60s, for example, the vanguard was definitely not here and white. It was in China and Vietnam and Cuba and Portugal's African colonies. So you take inspiration, I guess, and leadership and ideas, actually, where you can get them. But for instance, again, it's so superficial. You go to Tunisia for 5 days and pronounce on what's, but you just do your best. And in fact, an academic who makes a 10-year study is also, in a lot of ways, going to be superficial. But in Tunisia, for example, they are so behind the curve because they've had 50 years essentially of dictatorial politics that overthrowing the dictator was fantastic. And when they got around to the election, most of the people who were active in overthrowing the dictator weren't involved. It just didn't have any connection. And they weren't in a state of mind to actually improvise and theorize and be active about doing something. So in some way, so you can get inspiration from them. It was really phenomenal. But the election that happened was less inspirational, partly less because of the results, which was an Islamic government, basically an Islamist-led government, than because of the people who made the revolution, which they call it a revolution. You can argue. I met some hardcore Marxists there who said it wasn't a revolution, it doesn't meet the criteria of a revolution, But the people who were out there and who were militating on the internet, they didn't even vote most of them, or a lot of them anyway. Whereas in Spain, they've been through in Spain now they had 50 years of Franco or 45 years of Franco. That was bad, but they were part of Europe. They remembered the Republic. They'd been through the anarchism, so they did seem to have a sort of collective memory to draw on and to be more sophisticated. So I guess, I don't think there's any answer. I think the globalization is just there are no answers. But there's a lot of ideas, and you can come up with stuff if you pool them.
So Luke,
there's no more answers, but hopefully there's more questions.
So Romeo's had his hand up for a bit. He's right behind Mark, and then there's a question behind Romeo. It should be on. Just talk right into it.
Okay, so maybe I should go with low speak. I has microphone. Okay. Well, my question, I guess, we've been talking a lot about the internet and its role in popular uprisings, but is it perhaps too soon to get a real sense of whether or not the internet will make that long kind of a permanent change in how people organize? It's still very much a new phenomenon, something that didn't exist, more than a decade ago, and it's also very much a work in progress. The internet we have now isn't necessarily going to be the internet we'll have 50 years from now. So it's definitely changing and evolving with time. So perhaps a real historic sense of what the kind of changes it'll bring about is just impossible so far.
Well, and certainly to speak to your point, the fact that we keep treating the new media as if it's the old media speaks to the fact that we haven't adjusted to what it offers. And I think one of Rick's points around the leaderlessness, the lack of doctrine and dogma to the current movements, I think can be ascribed to the internet as a source of hope beyond ideology. But something we haven't talked about today, that perhaps we can't talk about today, is the surveillance capabilities of the internet. That was certainly employed in the Middle East in terms of governments both trying to identify who key agitators were and or then stealing their identity to use their identity to try to find out who else they know. That's certainly a dynamic, I think, that is not necessarily a positive. That also shows, I think, moving forward, the uncertainty, the open-endedness of these internet-type engagements. There's a question right behind Romeo.
So I actually have two questions. One is, you talked with nostalgia about 1989 and, how you did something great, but eventually didn't work because of electoral reform. I'm just wondering, do you look back at that now with regret and say, you know what, we could have done better, we expended a lot of energy and maybe it could have been used better? And actually to speak to, the role of the internet, do you think that maybe now the lessons of a movement can be archived better so that future generations can use them better? That's one. And secondly, we mentioned Jon Stewart, and over a year ago he had his Rally for Sanity, which gathered a lot of mainstream attention, but it hasn't been mentioned in the conversation around Occupy. But I'm just wondering if you think it has any salience to that conversation.
Yeah, I try and, as far as 1989, I shudder to think I sounded nostalgic. It wasn't like a great moment in history, but it was personally really, what was satisfying about it was one got to participate in the formal political process without joining some stupid party and going door to door telling people to vote Liberal or NDP or something. That you could actually be yourself in your own context, and just because of the odd sort of circumstances of it. And so that when we lost, it was a weird mixture of depression and exhilaration, simply because of having been able to be a part of the process in a serious way instead of reduced to this, vapid, form of somebody who votes once every 4 years in secret. So now what was the next thing? What was the? Oh, and can you archive these things and make sense of them? I actually don't.
The Jon Stewart's rally.
Well, no, but there was something about can we learn from it? I don't think there's. That's just my prejudice. I don't think there's much to learn from history. I think history is fun and interesting, but everybody dies, and nobody really remembers much. I mean, and you can probably figure things out if you put your heads together, and you do your best to come up with something that might make things a bit better than they are. So no, I'm not that interested in the Jon Stewart thing. I don't know. I think Stewart is still. I mean, he just cracks me up every night. I watched him last night, and I think in the States especially, Americans I know, I think Stewart kept them going through the Bush years. A lot of them will say that.
There was a number of hands at the back, and then there is a hand at the front after you hit a few in the back.
I want to go back to the free trade election, Rick. I still think that You're Waiting for Democracy should be a primary text for every school in Canada, and an understanding both of the electoral system and the challenge to that, but also that everything else that happens in the meantime. So I'm interested in knowing from you what you're thinking of the other things that you talked about in that book, daycare centers, food politics, the things that I see happening in Toronto, they're happening with such complexity and nuance that I find really inspiring. That doesn't touch the economic question, but does, I see a lot of change there, so I'm interested in hearing from you what you see the change over these 30 years in terms of those specific movements. The other quick thing is, on CBC not too long ago, there was representatives of the 1% that were talking, and they were talking about defending capitalism, and they were saying capitalism is fine. And I realized it sounded very, very strange, and I don't think it was since 1989 that the 1% actually talked about capitalism as a system, saying it's working really, really. The United States are in rough shape, but we're fine. And I realized that is exactly what they tried to avoid when they lost. Sure, they won, but as you've pointed out, they won, but they said we never want to be in this position again of having to defend capitalism. That's your job, media. That's your job, politics. That's where we got Harper from. So, to 2 points. One is sort of the in-between politics. The other one is it really true that we're seeing an actual questioning of, or even talking about capitalism within the mainstream that we haven't seen in so many years?
Well, I think you can always find, I think I said this, you can always find sources of inspiration. One of the nice things about I think about the sources of inspiration that now exist in whatever it is, local organizing or community efforts, food, stuff like the Witchwood Barns, whatever it is that non-doctrinaire quality of it, which I think just tended to hamper things. Now that actually relates to the second question about capitalism, because in some ways, and this is the seduction of these situations is you can just say things off the top of your head that you're not sure you would want to defend. But I'm not sure we should be, as they said in the 60s, too hung up about the concept of capitalism. I mean, capitalism, I sort of think, was a useful abstraction that Marx in particular developed in order to make a critique of the devastating injustice and misery that he saw being wreaked around him. But I think it over the years it gets reified and concretized as if it's a thing that you could find somewhere. If you could locate it properly and bomb it, it would go away. And that's, if it's useful to use it, okay, but if not, I wouldn't worry about it that much. I think, and I think the whole notion of Marxist, Leninist, the necessity of a revolution did have that kind of localizing quality. We have to find capitalism and destroy it in one overwhelming moment. I don't think that's turned out to be all that wise or all that sagacious or useful. So yeah, that would be how I think about that.
Megan, I think you had a question in the back.
Thanks. Well, I'm so excited to be here, and Rick, I particularly enjoyed the column you wrote talking about civil disobedience a little, I don't know, a week or so ago. So thanks for that.
It's really a privilege.
I've been studying how people use social media or digital media for dissent for about 10 years, and I'm from the States, so indeed Jon Stewart kept many of us alive during those Bush years. But I wanted to touch on a number of things that have been said. I was one of the people who shouted out, it's not over. Occupy is still alive and well, and I've happened to have been at 5 Occupy sites, and we interviewed, with my research team, I work at the University of Toronto, we interviewed 50 of the Occupy Toronto participants, and I wanted to share that, back to something said originally, the majority, the themes that really emerged in those conversations, and it was all people under 30, was this sort of meta-vision of a better world, and specifically things like you were talking about the indignados, which Occupy totally modeled itself on that. Really got a lot of the general assemblies, the hand movements, the food distribution, they directly modeled. But a lot of the young people were saying what they wanted out of it was indeed perhaps a different governmental structure, but certainly more public input. So it was precisely what you were talking about. In terms of why it's so important to me that we talk about it in the present tense, I mean, I'm just finishing an op-ed myself, and I'm giving 5 reasons why I think there's hope for Occupy. And I think there's very real reasons, and these aren't predictions, these are simply what is happening with Occupy in the US. These are not my reasons for hope, but they're what's happening, and I think the focus will be on some on corporate, stopping corporate personhood, a lot on foreclosures, a lot with the presidential campaign. And one of the things I think we will see give the movement legitimacy, and my particular issue is how does the mainstream media cover protests? I've been watching that for 20 years, and so I've got a lot to say about that. But what we will see is, like Obama even taking up some of this discourse, because it's radically changed the lexicon of internationally, you know, and I really think he will take up some of the discourse. I don't put a lot of hope into what Obama will transform that into necessarily, but it will be, you know, it will be covered. And if it isn't covered, my hope is that those who are involved in Occupy are savvy enough that what really disturbs me about the fact that the mainstream media often doesn't cover protest or buries it or misreports numbers, et cetera. It's a strange experience to feel that you're part of a movement and then that movement doesn't exist because it's not reported. You know, when I've gone internationally and people say, oh, was there an anti-war movement in, 2003 in the US? And they really weren't as acutely aware of that. And I'll just finish up and turn it over to you. The last thing I wanted to say was that it seems to me another reason for hope is that this is based on an economic crisis and based on increasingly shared class, socioeconomic class status, and that is almost unprecedented, I would say, as the basis of an international movement. And finally, one tiny little point of hope. Right now, during prime time, there are more viewers of Jon Stewart than there are of Fox News, at least during prime time. So.
But then that's why...
Let alone the internet, too, which I'm sure is a big part.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Rick.
and that's why I don't see why you shouldn't let it bother you so much when they either don't cover or distort in the mainstream media what the protest is. They've become quite irrelevant. It's astonishing, and that's the presence of an alternate. I teach this course at the U of T. It's a half course, but over the years it's been on media, and it's emphasized mass media. And I finally bit the bullet this year, changed the course, and I just put the mass media in a little chunk at the beginning because it's now a historical phenomenon, the mainstream media. And people, they're just masses of people from their 20s down, including my kid, who just don't tune in. And if they did, they'd find it funny if they read that. Our response to that Time magazine coverage, yours and mine probably, was outrage. How dare they either they ignore us or they lie about us. But I think most of them would have a more Stewartian response, which is just it's funny and irrelevant. I think that's part of.
So we've got 15 minutes left. We've got a hand at the back, at least 2 hands at the back, and 2 hands in the front. So we'll try to move it through to get everybody in. Go ahead, Luke.
Yeah, and just a reminder as we move towards the end to try to keep your questions singular and clear, and concise.
Yes, what I find about is that I guess from what I can tell, Occupy Toronto is probably one of the more in practice, as I said, is perhaps one of the more anticlimactic sort of branches of the whole Occupy movement, and I think a lot of that has to do with a way how, in terms of Toronto, it came to be framed as a kind of same old thing. I mean, in New York and so on in Zuccotti Park, it was, let's say, a novelty, a revelation of sorts. But in Toronto, I think it came to be like, in a way, compared to some places, kind of, again, framed in the same old way. You know, those OCAP types, if you want to use that as a kind of generic kind of slur, punchline, whatever else like that. But I think one other reason for the whole anticlimax is that what I feel in Toronto is that in a way that the truer Occupy energy was extra occupational, and its epicenter was not in St. James Park, but in Nathan Phillips Square. And in two things. I mean, first of all, the whole kind of melodrama and psychodrama related to the Ford mayoralty and the kind of mass reaction to that, but also in the whole late August spectacle of the Jack Layton chalk marking phenomenon, which in a way was like almost more magnificent and beautiful and whatever as a spectacle of something than, let's say, it's like those, I don't know, those grubby OCAP types in St. James Park could ever hope to be a few months later. And in a way, it's like much more truly, let's say, with that kind of mass reach that Occupy and kind of try. And I think there's still like I don't know if people have really let's say sort of put together the pieces of what that kind of late August in Nathan Phillips Square kind of as a mass phenomenon, even if it was more of a love-in than a kind of protest thing. But there's an energy there really has to be kind of in a way kind of let's say understood, harnessed. It still has to be it's like put in place and. It's more beautiful. It's more beautiful even than Occupy. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that.
So I think Adam makes an interesting point about the fact that we didn't really, as a city, I think beyond the moment of Layton's chalk memorial, really spend the time to look at the way in which we express not just that anguish, not just the respect, but a shared sense of mission, of purpose, that there goes back to your points of how you felt around the free trade debate. So do you want to very briefly talk a bit about Layton's death and the sort of place it had in the Canadian and in the Toronto discussion?
Well, to me the most striking moment actually was during the funeral at Roy Thompson Hall when Stephen Lewis, I can't remember what he said, but it was something about social democracy. And there was an explosion inside and outside the hall. And it was like one of those moments when he hit a chord. And I think that's out there. I think basically, not just this country, but you basically have a kind of social democratic consensus that's almost global, but which is not expressed in the formal political system. It's somewhat ironic because Jack wasn't particularly expressing it, and to the extent he had expressed it, he moved away from it. But it didn't matter. He embodied it at a certain point. In a sense, mostly I think after he got sick. And his vulnerability and mortality struck people, and somehow they made that connection. But I want to defend the Toronto Occupy movement against this charge in a sense because although I don't think they were as sophisticated as some of the people else, although the people I saw actually leading the conversations down there were actually quite sophisticated. And they handled the sectarians and what I would have said were probably agents, but that's my own background, the disruptors. They handled them beautifully and way better than we would have in my time. But what they partook of was that 1% versus 99%. And I just wanted to say, because Megan mentioned this too, this sort of consensus on the economy that's unusual. I don't think it is. It's mainly a result of the 1% themselves. They brought this on themselves. I don't think it's the misery of people who are suffering that's been the core of the reaction. There's large numbers of people always struggling. And it wasn't the crisis that happened in 2008, and it wasn't the bailout, it was their disgraceful, shameful, arrogant, unapologetic reaction to the bailout that really exposed them, I think, and that then set off the rest of the reaction, that justified the 1% versus 99%, which has rung so well, and that no amount of propagandizing from the side of the left could have accomplished the way their own graceless behavior did.
We've got Sharita and then Gio.
What I'd like to focus on is what you were talking about, the social democracy, and then it not having some kind of link with the electoral system, some way of expressing itself. It not having, let's say, a middle layer where it can be expressed
sort of
to the government.
belt.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
And I would like to ask, have you been watching at all some of the economic and social economic development in Quebec? Because that can be, although it's not, it's not very much in the public press. Many people, if I were to say the social economy or whatever, wouldn't really catch on to it. But that has been a movement, really, in Quebec over the past 15 years. And a movement as well, where they were able to get a minister of, one of the ministers of the Quebec government directly relating to their issues and bringing their issues up in terms of the government. The other thing that I would want to say about it is I think that that type of social democracy and economic model or variation probably would not have happened without the Parti Québécois, which I think was probably the most left government in Canada.
Thoughts, reactions?
No, I think that's right. I think that's right. I mean, Quebec, is in a sense a great model. The question is, can you, in what way can it be of use elsewhere or of inspiration? It is funny that we're quicker to look to Madrid than we are to Quebec. That's very Canadian.
Gio?
Thank you, Jesse. First off, an apology for being late. I was looking forward to this talk all day and had to juggle with my spouse and didn't get here in time. But having just walked in, just to catch the Q&A, there was a tweet that I caught up there about, you said something about ideology and somebody tweeted, there's no such thing as non-ideology. But to come back to you, Rick,
you're great. Responding to a tweet that was made while you were...
Well, 140 character attention span, well, you got to work with what you've got.
You said beyond ideology.
Oh, right. Thank you, John. And I want to come back to Rick's comment just a few minutes ago.
I'd say bullshit.
But Rick,
but politely,
if I may just ask, you made a great comment about these sort of non-ideological activities that are going on right now, that are beyond left and right and the traditional dichotomies, and there's so much hope in that. It's almost like we've run through every possible model, and now we're, searching for some kind of acceptance of,
I don't think it's so much beyond left and right as to recognize that left and right are sort of heuristic categories that can help you or not help you, but that aren't, they're not that, but not to reify them up there on a screen or in a book or in a movement or something. The conflicts exist. The trouble and the decisions have to be made, and there are going to be people who are going to, they're going to be winners and losers in these fights, so there always are. But not to get trapped. My sort of experience in those sort of formative years was that you did get trapped in these things. Man, you thought Mao had the answers or Lenin had the answers. Look, people would even laugh when you say it now. Can you believe it? But it seemed absolutely real.
Now, we've got one last question in the back, and then I have a question myself that I'd like to ask. But I'd like to take this moment before we hit the last question to remind you all that you are here at the Academy of the Impossible. This is the first in our Impossible Ideas series. Yes, thank you, your friend. Thank you. Many of you here are members of the Academy, although you may not be fully aware of what that membership means. It probably means you've come into this space previously and have to somewhat agreed to be further engaged in the space. For those of you that this is your first time here in the Academy, we do have a pay what you can scenario, both for the drinks at the back, but also for the event today. You do not have to pay. If you do not feel that tonight's conversation has been stimulated in any way, you may leave and write a torrid complaint on the web that thousands will see. So fear not, there is a course for your dissent and criticism. But if you do feel like supporting the activities of the Academy, Emily, who is waving the little donation box back there, would be happy to accept any support you can. Next Thursday, we are starting the first in our Play the Impossible series, in which we'll spend about 30 minutes talking about a video game. Next week, it's Minecraft. And then spend about an hour and a half playing the video game on the large screen. So for those of you who do play video games, please come out. For those of you who don't play video games and really don't understand why others do, please come out, because it could be an excellent opportunity to learn and commingle. We will also be having an event this Sunday, the first in our YouTube school, in which we meet to discuss how online video, how YouTube works, by both watching YouTube videos and talking about YouTube videos. And of course, there's lots and lots of other events planned and other programming, which you can all learn on our website, impossible.ws. A question,
Okay.
second last question.
So talking about impossible ideas, so I just want to toss this out there. Rick, earlier you were talking about social movements having to engage with the existing electoral system to affect their agenda, yeah? What about the possibility of the flip side of that?
Of what?
Of the flip side, changing the electoral system to more closely match what's out there. So maybe I'll toss this out to both of you. You can comment on the possibility of using the internet to move away from the 4-year three-party, two-party system to more of a on-demand referendum type system on issues instead of on parties at election time.
Well, the question again would be, how do you get there? How does that, what is the actual mechanism by which that happens? I think also there is a bit of, I'd be all in favor of proportional representation, but and we've had a number of referendums in the last 10 years, and they failed. I thought it was a no-brainer. I thought once people got a chance, we'd have it, but it didn't come out that way. And the other sobering aspect of that is in countries that do have it, they're still screwed up. So that may not be the answer, but
Well, and here in Canada, electorally, we have a very real rural suburban split. That if you look at those referenda, urban voters voted overwhelmingly in favor of electoral reform. And it was rural voters, both in British Columbia and Ontario, who voted to reject it. So I kind of feel that from either end, there's a need to bridge that rural-urban divide, that suburban-urban divide in politics, so that we don't have the type of Rob Ford, or what the suburbs felt, David Miller, in terms of an imbalance. But I do believe that no technology is neutral, that the medium is the message, and every new technology has hidden effects. And I think online voting, which is going to be introduced for the next federal election, which will be introduced for the next provincial election, maybe even the next municipal, that the existing politicians see it as neutral. But I don't believe it is. And I think it has two very clear consequences, and then many which are not clear and I can't speculate on. One is exactly what you're inferring. Greater referenda, greater opportunity to vote, which may not be a good thing, but I think it will be a byproduct of it. And the other byproduct is that machines will vote. There was a time when it was absurd to say that people who don't own property should vote. The same time it was absurd to say that women should vote. Now we see the opposite as absurd, that it's absurd to deny people who don't own property to vote, to deny women the vote. People are going to think that it was absurd for us to deny machines the vote. And the fact is, machines perhaps make a lot better decisions every day than humans do, and make a lot of decisions in our life that we are all beholden to. Now, I'm saying all this tongue-in-cheek, but it is meant to say that e-voting will have to deal with the enfranchisement of the machines, thinking machines, which is a conversation. Well, yes, and it is a conversation we will have here in the Academy, but not tonight. The last question I'd like to end with, because it's something we haven't talked about tonight, although we did kind of bump into, is the U.S. election this year. And it certainly is not, I think, within the context of revolt and popular uprising, but it is within the context of media, and it is within the context of Canadians, for us, I think, thoroughly entertaining, especially the Republican side, in the farce, if not the horror of it all. I'm curious if you'd like to end on thoughts of whether A, this election will become even more absurd than it already is, and whether Obama will ever get his head out of his ass and live up to the type of hope that he sold to get in there in the first place that he clearly hasn't really delivered on.
Well, let me try and be really clipped on several things. One is this question of voting and voting electronically. I don't consider that the essence of democracy is voting. The essence of democracy is collective discussion and deliberation. So the real question isn't how do you vote, it's whether the internet can be a vehicle not only to vote, but for people to deliberate collectively to improve their judgment. Because often when you have a discussion, if people just vote, then they're just stuck inside their own opinions. They're often perfectly prepared, unless they're professional intellectuals or something, to abandon their opinions when they hear something that makes sense. Now on the U.S. election, I don't know. I always thought the question about Obama was why he actually wanted to be president. I mean, it wasn't so it's whether he could actually do anything, whether you can actually do anything when you're president. And I was willing to withhold judgment. I think it's now clear you probably can't. And he probably would have done more good by community organizing in Chicago. I want to say one last thing, which is about this whole evening and democracy and the internet. I have, because one of the things I've learned, I think, just in the last hour and a half, in a way, is, I've always disliked these formats where we are sitting up here above and people ask you questions, and it's just ridiculously, tempting to, have answers when people ask you questions. Whereas there's, every likelihood that there's more answers, God knows where out there or anywhere, or just sitting quietly and thinking than there would be. But it's hard to resist, and yet this whole format resists that, because I can't, I keep seeing these things going up, and feeling a little stupid. Without this process, the most you could do is kind of what I've done in meetings like this was you just whisper to witty and contrary things to the person beside you. But here you confront me with it directly, And it's democratizing. It's genuinely democratizing, and because it breaks down the. It doesn't matter that we're up here. It breaks down the hierarchy. That we're up here authoritatively, because I just look up there and I see this stuff, even about my socks.
Well, it's a bit of a play that the screen is the ultimate authority. We are the sacrificial lambs who have come on the altar to be slayed in front of the screen by whoever wants to tweet.
And the ongoing butt of jokes, it's just, or having things pointed out that you said. So you can't. It's not as easy to get away with just shooting your mouth off and being impressed with yourself when somebody who knows something and can contradict you can just say it.
And I think we can all agree that Rick has been a really, really good sport, both in terms of, we'll give, because I gave John a hard time on the first question, I will give him one last question before I finally wrap up. Okay, yes.
Correct, the gentleman at the back.
Yes.
And 99% of Canadians, democracy is not set up on a party system. He said about 3 parties. Democracy set up on representatives and a land mass. Democracy works if you apply simple principles. It's totally hijacked by presidential systems and party systems.
Yes.
And that's where we have to take it back, because it's our right and democracy is ours, not theirs.
And I would use that as an opportunity to give another plug, that not this Sunday, but the Sunday after we have the first session of our campaign school, in which we talk perhaps about the post-partisan Canadian political environment. So I think we can all agree Rick has been a great sport, both in being the first person in this series with, 8 days notice I think I gave you in terms
Ample.
of... Yes, and in dealing with a buggy sound system as the host, also plays tech, and the type of mashup that we were trying to do with the screen. So if we could all give Rick a very generous round.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Now, as Rick mentioned, he does have a 13-year-old who he's left home alone, so I do certainly encourage him to take off.
He's fine, but I worry.
Yes, who knows what is being downloaded on the home internet as we speak. But please stick around. There is snacks and beverages in the back. Emily is here again to twist your arm in any way possible. Do feel encouraged to get involved in the Academy. We are in the final stages of defining membership. There's a programming committee on the 11th. We're receiving a number of really interesting program submissions from people who want to run their own programs or events here. And do check our website, impossible.ws, for other events. And thank you very much for all coming out on a Thursday night. Thank you.